Fake HOA cops broke in with guns drawn. My twin Seal brothers had them face down in seconds. You ever think your neighborhood's the safest place you could be? That nothing bad could possibly happen behind your own front door? Well, that's what I thought. Until one night, a group of fake HOA cops kicked in my door with guns drawn. They thought they had the upper hand, but they didn't know my twin Seal brothers were home. In seconds, those so-called enforcers were face down on my living room floor, begging for mercy. The night started like any other, quiet and ordinary, with nothing hinting at the chaos that was about to erupt. I had just settled into the couch, letting the silence of the neighborhood wash over me. Outside, the street lamps cast their dim glow across the driveways, shadows stretching long and eerie. It was the kind of stillness that made you feel safe, like the world outside your walls couldn't possibly touch you. But that illusion shattered the moment I heard the first noise. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss. A dull creak from the porch, the kind of sound an old house might make settling into the night. But then came the sharp metallic click, unmistakable, deliberate, and completely out of place. My chest tightened, a wave of dread rolling through me as I froze, listening intently. Then, without warning, the door exploded open, splintering wood and rattling the walls as heavy boots stormed inside. My heart leapt to my throat as I found myself staring at the unthinkable. Men dressed in tactical gear, black vests marked with bold white letters spelling out HOA security, guns raised and aimed directly at me. The force of their entry was so sudden and violent that, for a second, I couldn't even process if it was real. Their faces were hidden behind balaclavas, eyes sharp and unyielding, scanning every corner of the room as if they were trained professionals. The way they moved was terrifyingly precise. One man shouting commands, another sweeping the corners with his weapon, and two more pushing deeper inside with brutal efficiency. "On the ground now," one barked, his voice booming with authority that felt manufactured, rehearsed, almost too polished, as if he had studied the tone of law enforcement but lacked the soul of it. My entire body locked up, adrenaline surging, and I knew instantly this wasn't some official visit about HOA fees or neighborhood regulations. No, this was something darker, something staged with the intention to dominate and terrify. The muzzle of a rifle glared in the low light as it tilted toward me, and I felt my skin prickle as every instinct screamed to run. Yet I was rooted in place, a mix of shock and disbelief freezing me. These weren't cops. Not real ones. Their badges, hastily clipped to their vests, looked generic and unconvincing up close. And yet the guns were very real, their barrels dark holes that could erase me in an instant. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow as my mind raced through possibilities. Were they robbers? Mercenaries? Or was this some twisted message being sent through the guise of authority? The leader stepped closer, boots thudding heavy against the hardwood, his shadow stretching across me as he leaned forward, his weapon unwavering. His eyes locked on mine through the slit of his mask, cold and calculating, and I felt like prey cornered by a predator. Another man kicked the broken door wider, the night air rushing in, carrying with it the unsettling scent of gun oil and sweat. They moved with the confidence of men who thought the game was already won, who believed they held absolute control in that moment. I wanted to shout, to demand who they were and why they were here, but my voice caught in my throat, suffocated by fear. The only sound I could manage was the rapid thudding of my heartbeat, loud enough that it felt like the intruders could hear it too. My mind flashed to my twin brothers in the back of the house, unaware of the danger that had just breached our sanctuary. The thought of them stepping into this chaos made my pulse spike even higher, but I couldn't make a sound to warn them. One wrong move and this night could end in disaster. The men fanned out quickly, two covering the hallway while the leader kept his weapon trained on me. I caught the faint shimmer of duct tape sticking out of one man's vest pocket, and a chill shot down my spine as I realized they hadn't come just to scare me. They had come to restrain, to silence, maybe worse. Each second dragged like an eternity, my thoughts spinning between panic and strategy, searching desperately for some way out of this nightmare as the chilling reality settled in. I was no longer safe, not even in my own home. Their uniforms were designed to trick the eye, to make you believe they were legitimate. At first glance, the black tactical gear looked official, every strap and patch placed with deliberate precision. The bold white letters across their chests read HOA Police, a term so absurd it almost made me question if I was dreaming. But in that moment, with the barrels of their rifles gleaming in the low light, there was nothing funny about it. They had gone to great lengths to make themselves look like a force of authority, and if you didn't look too closely, you'd swear they belonged to some elite unit sanctioned to keep the peace. It was the details that gave them away. The cheap Velcro patches that didn't quite match the fabric, the knockoff radios clipped to their shoulders, the mismatched boots that scuffed against my floor. They were playing dress-up in the most dangerous way imaginable, and the stakes were my life. The leader's vest bore a plastic badge, shiny enough to reflect the lamplight but flimsy upon inspection. The kind you'd expect from a costume shop rather than a government office. Another man wore aviator sunglasses, absurd in the darkness of my living room, as though he wanted to hide the uncertainty in his eyes behind mirrored lenses. Their belts sagged slightly under the weight of gear that didn't look standard issue. Cheap handcuffs, duct tape rolls, and tasers that rattled loosely in their holsters. They looked official enough to fool a stranger in passing, but under the sharp pressure of the moment, the illusion cracked. What terrified me wasn't just how convincing they tried to look, but how intentional the disguise was. They hadn't just grabbed random gear. They had studied. They had researched how to appear like enforcement, down to the stance, the clipped radio chatter, the authoritative tone in their voices. One barked into his shoulder radio, though I noticed the device wasn't even turned on. A dead piece of plastic meant only to sell the image. Their ruse was designed for intimidation, to erase any question of defiance before it could form in the mind of their target. They didn't need to be real cops. They only needed to look like them long enough to get control. The way they positioned themselves spoke volumes. Two flanked me, weapons drawn and eyes darting sharply, while the others held formation as if they were clearing a crime scene. I could see the sweat glistening under the leader's mask, a sign that their performance wasn't as flawless as they hoped. The air between us was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by their heavy boots and the occasional sharp command. "Stay down," one growled, his voice low but shaking at the edges. It was the kind of voice that wanted badly to sound steady, but couldn't quite hide the fact that he wasn't used to situations like this. I forced myself to take in every detail, even as my pulse raced. Their gloves were mismatched, one wearing tactical knuckle guards, another with thin leather driving gloves. Their rifles, though real, bore scratches and worn grips, as though they had been bought second-hand or stolen rather than issued. Their masks were plain black fabric, no insignias or emblems, hiding not just their faces but their lack of legitimacy. Everything about them screamed counterfeit, yet the danger was all too real. A fake gunman can still pull a real trigger, and their costumes didn't make the bullets any less lethal. The longer I watched, the more unsettling it became. They carried themselves with the arrogance of men who thought their disguise made them untouchable. They had banked on the fear that uniforms and weapons inspire, assuming that anyone confronted by their show of force would obey without question. And in many cases, they probably would have been right. Most people don't dare challenge authority when staring down the barrel of a gun, even if something feels off. That's what made their charade so dangerous. They weren't just invaders. They were predators who knew exactly how to manipulate the instincts of their victims. The realization struck me harder than the gun pointed in my face. If they were willing to go this far, to risk breaking into my home dressed like enforcers of the law, then they weren't afraid of consequences. This wasn't random. This was planned, orchestrated, and carried out with the cold confidence of people who believed they'd walk away without ever being questioned. Their fake uniforms weren't just costumes. They were weapons designed to strip me of resistance, to make me compliant before a single order was given. And for a chilling moment, I could feel myself slipping into the trap they had built, the urge to obey clawing at me even as my mind screamed to resist. The instant I realized their guns were aimed directly at me, the world seemed to narrow into a tunnel. Everything else, the furniture, the broken door, the cold draft rushing in from outside, faded into the background, leaving only the gleam of the muzzles pointed at my chest. I could see the tiny reflections of the lamplight bouncing off the barrels, and each one felt like an unspoken threat, a silent promise that any wrong move could end my life in a heartbeat. My lungs tightened as I tried to steady my breathing, but it came out uneven, shaky, the sound far too loud in the stillness of the room. It was as if my body already knew what my mind was just beginning to accept. This was not a drill, not some bluff or scare tactic. These men had come here armed and ready to use those weapons if I gave them even the slightest reason. One of them took a step closer, the heavy tread of his boot echoing against the hardwood floor, and raised his rifle higher until the black circle of the barrel aligned perfectly with my forehead. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the clock on the wall, every other sound that might have grounded me in normalcy. All I could hear now was the blood rushing through me and the commanding voice of the man who barked, "Don't move!" His tone cut sharp and unforgiving, the kind of voice that didn't leave room for hesitation. My knees felt weak, and for a fleeting second, I thought they might buckle under me, sending me crashing to the floor without them even having to fire a shot. The chilling thing wasn't just that their guns were real, it was the way they held them. Their fingers rested close enough to the triggers to send my nerves into overdrive, and their postures were practiced, as if they'd rehearsed this very moment. They weren't flailing or sloppy like amateurs. They were deliberate, calculated, ready. I watched the faint movement of one man's chest, steady as he breathed. His eyes locked on me with a predator's focus. Another tilted his head slightly, scanning for sudden movement, his weapon never wavering from its line of aim. They were coordinated, each of them holding their role with the kind of discipline that made the entire encounter even more terrifying. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it stuck like a stone, making every breath a struggle. I thought about speaking, maybe asking who they were or why they were here, but my mouth was dry, and the thought of drawing their attention even more sharply onto me felt like stepping onto thin ice. One wrong word could shatter the fragile thread holding me in place. My mind ran wild with scenarios. What if they pulled the trigger by mistake? What if one of them got spooked by a sudden movement? What if they weren't just here to scare me, but to make sure I didn't walk away from this night at all? Each possibility hit me harder than the last, and still I stood frozen, barely daring to blink. The leader shifted slightly, his rifle never leaving its target, and I caught the faint glint of sweat dripping down from his temple beneath the mask. That tiny detail sent a fresh jolt of unease through me. If he was sweating, it meant he was nervous, and a nervous man with a gun was more dangerous than anything. My chest heaved as I realized I wasn't just facing the threat of a calculated assault. I was staring down men who were wound tight, on edge, and potentially one heartbeat away from firing without meaning to. Their disguise might have been fake, but the tension and danger in the room were brutally real. Every instinct screamed at me to find cover, to duck, to throw myself behind the couch or dash toward the hallway. But the weapons followed me with every twitch of a muscle. They had me locked in, and they knew it. The coldness in their eyes was matched only by the weight of the rifles aimed at me, an oppressive force that made the air itself feel heavy. My fingers tingled as adrenaline surged through me, and I had to fight the urge to raise my hands in surrender, afraid even that small movement might be misread as aggression. Time stretched unnaturally, each second dragging like an hour. I tried to steady myself by focusing on the sound of my breathing, counting in my head, anything to keep panic from spiraling into something uncontrollable. But the truth was, I had never been so close to death before. The realization that one twitch of their fingers could erase me from existence hung over me like a dark cloud, pressing down until I could hardly stand upright. And then, in the silence that followed the last barked command, I caught the faintest sound from down the hallway, a creak soft but unmistakable. My stomach clenched as I realized I wasn't alone in this nightmare. My brothers had heard the commotion. The moment the sound from the hallway reached the intruders, their heads snapped in unison, rifles shifting with sharp precision toward the darkened corridor. I knew instantly my brothers had been alerted, and a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over me. Fear for their safety, hope that their presence could change the tide, and dread of what would happen when they came face to face with the men who had broken into our home. My twin brothers, identical in looks and equally matched in strength and training, had never been ones to back down from danger. Growing up, They had always carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever threat crossed their path. They weren't just protective. They were relentless when it came to keeping families safe. And now, with armed strangers invading our living room, I knew that instinct would ignite without hesitation. The intruders shifted their formation, two still keeping their weapons trained on me while the others aimed down the hallway. The leader's voice cut through the tension, low and sharp. "Who's there? Show yourself." The demand carried authority, but I recognized the underlying tremor, the slip in his tone that betrayed unease. He wasn't expecting resistance. He had counted on a fast, clean operation, fear keeping me docile until they had me restrained. But the presence of my brothers was a variable he hadn't calculated for, and I could sense the cracks beginning to form in their confident facade. Then, with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from discipline and training, my brothers stepped into view. They moved as one, their frames filling the hallway, eyes sharp and unflinching as they assessed the scene before them. No words were spoken, no questions asked. They didn't need to know the details to understand exactly what was happening. Their gaze swept over the masked intruders, the weapons drawn, the broken door behind them. Every second stretched taut as their muscles tensed, ready for what was about to unfold. The leader tried to seize control, thrusting his rifle toward them in a warning gesture. "Stay where you are," he barked, louder now, as though volume could mask the unease creeping into his command. But my brothers didn't flinch. They had faced worse, stared down threats more formidable than these imposters dressed in cheap gear. Their silence was more intimidating than any words could have been. It was the calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that promised explosive force the moment the line was crossed. I could see it in the intruders' eyes. They had expected easy compliance, a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves facing two men who radiated control and confidence, their every movement a reminder that they were not prey but predators in their own right. My brother's presence shifted the balance instantly, and the fake cops knew it. The man nearest the door adjusted his grip on his weapon, his stance faltering just enough to betray nerves. Another flicked his eyes to the leader, searching for direction, the first signs of doubt creeping in. My pulse quickened as I watched the tension coil tighter, both sides measuring the other, waiting for the first move. I knew my brothers well enough to recognize the signals, the slight shift of weight in their stances, the way their hands flexed as if ready to strike, the faint narrowing of their eyes that always came before they exploded into action. They were calculating distance, angles, the number of opponents, and the quickest way to neutralize the threat. Their training wasn't formal military, but it was forged from years of discipline, strength, and a bond that made them unstoppable when they worked together. The leader tried once more to assert dominance, his voice rising in forced command. "I said stay where you are." The edge of desperation in his tone betrayed him, and that was all the opening my brothers needed. I caught the faintest exchange of glances between them, a silent language only they shared, and in that instant, I knew the fight was inevitable. The air grew heavier, charged with anticipation, every heartbeat syncing with the growing intensity of the standoff. My body tensed, bracing for the chaos I knew was seconds away. The intruders still held their weapons, but their composure was slipping fast, and against the unwavering resolve of my brothers, they were starting to look less like professionals and more like desperate men in costumes. The balance of power was shifting, and I could feel it in the room like a current, building toward the inevitable collision that was about to erupt in front of me. The moment the silent exchange passed between my brothers, everything erupted into motion. What had been a tense standoff just seconds before turned into a blur of explosive force, the kind that leaves no room for hesitation. My twin brothers surged forward in perfect unison, their movements sharp and precise, like a storm unleashed after too long being held back. The intruders barely had time to process what was happening before they were overwhelmed. One brother lunged at the leader, striking upward to push the rifle barrel off target, while the other closed the distance on the man to the left, grabbing his weapon arm with a speed that seemed impossible. The room filled with the chaotic sounds of struggle, boots scraping across the hardwood, grunts of exertion, and the clatter of metal as rifles were knocked aside. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst, adrenaline surging as I watched the scene unfold right in front of me. It was like watching a choreographed fight, each of my brothers anticipating the other's movements without the need for words. They had grown up moving in sync, trained by nothing more than years of shared determination. And now, in the face of real danger, that bond became their most powerful weapon. The leader let out a sharp yell as my brother slammed him against the wall, the rifle dropping from his hands and clattering onto the floor. Before he could recover, a swift knee to the stomach knocked the air from his lungs. His authority shattered in a single, brutal instant. The other brother twisted the intruder's arm so sharply that the weapon slipped free, skittering across the floor out of reach. The man cried out in pain, his voice high and panicked, nothing like the commanding bark he had tried to use moments before. Another intruder tried to step in, raising his weapon, but he was too slow. My brother was already there, sweeping his leg out in a forceful arc that took the man's feet out from under him. He crashed to the ground with a heavy thud, his rifle flying from his grasp as he struggled to regain his senses. The fourth man hesitated, his mask slipping slightly as his eyes darted between his fallen comrades and the twins bearing down on him. His hands trembled on the weapon, the confidence he had carried in the doorway gone, replaced with the stark realization that they were no longer in control. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, barely able to breathe as the scene unfolded in a blur of motion. Every second felt stretched, my eyes flicking from one twin to the other as they dismantled the intruder's plan with ruthless efficiency. Their faces were calm, their expressions focused, like they had done this 100 times before. Each move was calculated, each strike delivered with purpose. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, only the relentless drive to take back the control that had been stolen when the door first crashed open. The leader tried to rally, pushing off the wall with a wild swing, but my brother caught his arm mid-motion, twisting it until he dropped with a pained groan. His mask shifted, revealing eyes wide with fear, a far cry from the cold, commanding presence he had tried to maintain. On the other side of the room, the man who had been thrown to the floor scrambled for his weapon, but a swift kick sent it sliding across the hardwood, out of reach once more. My other brother pinned him down, his knee pressed hard into the intruder's back, forcing him face first against the floor. The air was filled with shouts now, not of authority, but of panic. The men who had stormed into the house with rifles raised and confidence high were now reduced to gasping and struggling beneath the weight of two determined brothers. Their carefully crafted disguise had been stripped away, leaving nothing but desperation. My brothers worked in tandem, forcing each man down, their movements sharp and controlled as they wrestled the intruders into submission. One by one, the fake cops found themselves with their faces pressed to the hardwood, their weapons out of reach, their bravado shattered beyond repair. The leader groaned as my brother tightened his hold, forcing him flat against the wall. Another cried out when his wrist was pinned awkwardly, the sound breaking through the chaos like a signal of their complete defeat. The living room, once a scene of invasion and fear, had transformed into a battleground reclaimed. The balance of power flipped so completely it was almost hard to believe these were the same men who had stormed in with guns drawn just minutes before. And still, my brothers moved with precision, their strength and resolve leaving no doubt that the intruders were finished. As the last of the intruders was forced down onto the hardwood, their weapons scattered and their shouts reduced to strained groans, the truth behind their presence began to surface. The masks that had given them an aura of faceless authority were now askew, some pulled halfway off during the struggle, revealing anxious eyes and clenched jaws. Stripped of their false command, they looked less like trained enforcers and more like cornered criminals. My brothers kept them pinned, their movements firm but controlled, making sure none of them had a chance to rise or reach for the weapons lying across the room. I stood frozen for a moment, my chest still heaving from the adrenaline, trying to make sense of how my own home had turned into the scene of a violent ambush. One of the men, his cheek pressed hard against the floor, muttered curses under his breath. My brother leaned closer, his tone low but unyielding as he demanded, "Who sent you?" The man tried to stay silent, his body tensing under the pressure, but a sharp twist of his arm pulled a strangled grunt from him. The leader, still pinned against the wall, shot a look at his companions, a silent warning not to speak, but it was already too late. Their unity was crumbling, the false bravado that had carried them into the house dissolving into raw fear under the relentless grip of men who weren't about to let them walk out unscathed. The leader tried to regain control, his voice hoarse as he spat out, "You don't know who you're messing with." The words carried no weight now, nothing but hollow bravado. My other brother tightened his hold on the man he had pinned, pressing him harder into the floor, and the sharp cry that followed was answer enough. These weren't professionals backed by a real organization. They were pawns, thugs dressed in imitation uniforms, sent on a mission they had believed would be easy. But the moment their disguises were stripped away, so too was the illusion of power. As I stepped closer, I caught sight of the patches on their vests, peeling at the edges, the letters crooked and barely holding onto the fabric. Up close, they were even more laughable than intimidating, and yet these cheap symbols had been enough to send my heart racing with fear just minutes ago. It was a chilling reminder of how fragile the boundary was between safety and danger, how quickly a false image of authority could manipulate trust and instill obedience. My stomach twisted as the reality sank in. These men hadn't been after me at random. They had come with purpose. One of the intruders finally broke, his voice cracking as he muttered, "We didn't want it to go this way." The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable laced with desperation. My brother's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening as he pressed for more. "Who sent you?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the leader, but the weight of fear seemed to win out over loyalty. "It was the association," he finally choked out, the confession spilling into the silence like a crack of thunder. The word hit me like a blow. Association. It wasn't just a random gang, not some burglars looking for a quick score. It was tied back to the very HOA that had been lurking over our neighborhood, the same group that had pretended to hold authority over every aspect of our lives. They had sent these men, not to protect, not to enforce rules, but to intimidate, to break us down, to force submission through fear. My pulse quickened again, not from panic this time, but from anger that burned hotter with every second. The leader thrashed under my brother's grip, his voice raised in a frantic attempt to silence the confession. "Shut up. Don't say another word." His mask slipped fully away now, revealing a face twisted with rage and fear. His control over the situation shattered completely. My brothers exchanged a glance, a silent understanding that the truth was now out in the open. The intruders had come under orders, disguised as law enforcers, with the intent to break into our home and scare us into submission. The room felt different now. The fear that had gripped me so tightly before was still there, but it was mixed with a sharp clarity, the kind that comes when the pieces of a puzzle finally click together. They hadn't just picked our house. They had targeted us. The fake uniforms, the weapons, the dramatic entrance. It had all been part of a plan orchestrated by the people who thought they could control everything in our neighborhood. They had underestimated the bond of my family, and now their plan lay broken at our feet, as powerless as the men who had carried it out.